What's up, everybody? We're going to talk about the World Trade Organization today, or the WTO. Now, this is one of the planet's kind of largest intergovernmental organizations. When we talk about multilateralism and globalization, so countries essentially working together to cooperate, or at least try to cooperate. The big organizations we usually look at are the United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and then the World Trade Organization. So we're going to talk about that for a bit today because it's had quite an important role and it's reflected some of the values of, let's say, the present time, whatever time that is. Now, the World Trade Organization isn't that old, but its precursor was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, or GATT. Now, if you remember from some of our previous lessons and discussions, GATT was formed in 1948. The idea of it came out of the Bretton Woods Conference. So, going back to Bretton Woods, we see that desire to have economic stability in the world, because the belief was, and this is John Maynard Keynes sort of thinking, political stability would equal, or economic stability would equal political stability. Sorry, I had that backwards. Essentially, if your economy is doing good, you're not going to go to war with another country. And so the belief and what's pushed kind of in the 20th century, at least the second half, is, well, let's cooperate with each other because that should help us all grow. A couple key concepts, though, that we should quickly address so you kind of understand. Prior to the world wars or World War II, the main sort of economic principle that countries use is what we would call protectionism. This sort of concept goes all the way back to mercantilism, countries wanting to protect their own local industries and export more than they are importing. That is called balance of trade. And that's kind of the economic principle that a lot of countries use to determine how they would interact with the world. After World War II, people kind of decide maybe we should loosen up these rules, make trade more flexible, have more free trade. And we see that kind of take off. So the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, this was formed in January 1st, 1995. So again, it evolved from GATT. A lot of those same principles are there. Our original objective was to reduce and eventually eliminate tariff barriers to international trade. Tariffs are those taxes or duties that are put on goods coming into your country. For example, let's say somebody manufactures scissors, but so does Canada. To try to promote the Canadian scissor manufacturers, if you make the ones coming into Canada more expensive by putting a tariff on it, then people are going to purchase the local ones. Now, what this does, though, is it makes goods more expensive. So the WTO, they try to get rid of these tariffs. This is the largest international economic organization in the world. There are some countries, though, that are not in it. Here's a few that I've listed. So it began with the emphasis on reducing tariffs. And again, we just mentioned what a tariff is. But what does this represent? So this would be what we would call free trade. That's an important concept here when we talk about economic globalization. And we see that push almost throughout the whole world moving towards free trade. That's kind of your more right side of the political spectrum ideas. The benefit, well, again, if you remove tariffs on goods, then the consumer should benefit because the prices of goods are cheaper. If we were to use automobiles as an example, the more you tax the parts coming from other countries, that tax as an increase in the cost of production all ends up falling on the consumer at some point. So the more tariffs there are, you are going to end up paying more for goods. Now, we'll talk more about how this has been problematic recently, but as of 2007, so if the stat's a little dated, but nonetheless, WTO countries accounted for 96.4% of global trade and 96.7% of global gross domestic product. So even though not every country in the world is a part of the WTO, you can see that percentage-wise, it's close to the entire planet's global wealth and trade. So if you're not a part of the WTO, there are some disadvantages to you. On average, they face an increase of tariffs on their exports by 32%. Would this make your products more appealing? No, right? Something that was $100 in Canada, if it was being imported from a country that was not a part of the WTO, this is saying that it might cost $132. So it's very difficult for countries that are not in the WTO to trade, at least on even grounds. So what are the main functions of the WTO? We're just going to talk about some of the really basic ones. They oversee the implementation, administration, and operation of the covered agreements. The WTO is a forum. So it's a place where countries can get together, they can negotiate, and then they can settle disputes. And so this is where agreements are made, disagreements are brought, and the goal is that at the WTO, these can be solved. So they also are supposed to provide transparency. So any sort of trade policy that's being conducted, there's surveillance done. This means that things aren't really operating behind closed doors. They also are supposed to assist least developed and low-income countries through technical cooperation and training. This is a similar sort of goal that you see in some of the other big international organizations as well. What are the principles of the WTO? Well, they're supposed to be non-discriminatory. And this is shown through the most favored nation policy, or the MFN. What this essentially means is that if you're a WTO member, you have to have the same conditions on all trade with other WTO members. So you can't play favorites. So I can't say, I'm going to tariff the heck out of this country, so their goods are super expensive, but I'm not going to do it to the other WTO countries. The WTO would say, no, that is not fair, so you can't do that. So you're supposed to be an even playing ground. Now, one place where this is different is if a country is a part of a trade agreement, for example, NAFTA or CUSMA, the kind of NAFTA upgraded, if you have a sort of trade agreement with other countries, well, that you can have different rules with that doesn't apply then to the rest of the WTO rules. WTO also values transparency. So members have to publish trade regulations and notify about change. So essentially, trade is supposed to be free. The rules are supposed to apply to everybody the same. You're not supposed to be able to discriminate. And you're also supposed to make your trade regulations public, so we all know what other people are doing. One of the powers of the World Trade Organization, though, is through passing economic sanctions and using multilateral action instead of unilateral action. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, so let's break it down. Well, first off, multilateral versus unilateral. Multi meaning multiple. Multilateral is essentially lots of countries working together. Unilateral would be one country doing one thing. So what are sanctions, though? A sanction is similar to a punishment. If you do something that the WTO were to say is illegal, the WTO members could then put sanctions on a country. Sanctions could be something like, you are not allowed to export your oil. And if you even try, no one will buy it. So sanctions can really cripple an economy and can be quite useful. If you're a wealthier economy, well, that's a little different. But so why would sanctions and multilateral action work? It's kind of like power in numbers, right? The more countries that are trying to work together, the better chance of something happening. And sanctions, no country's goal is to have a reduction in trade or a reduction in economic growth. And so if lots of countries are, let's say, teaming up on you, you're probably going to concede and do what they want. Now let's talk briefly about some of the changes that have happened with the WTO. So a quick recap of the past 70 years. After the Bretton Woods Conference, the world decided to really work together. All these different intergovernmental organizations helped with this. Trade moved towards free trade. People were working multilaterally together. But one of the things we see is big countries such as the United States, they tend to have more power. They also have more influence within these organizations. We're going to look at a case study about bananas. A couple details about it. Essentially, the USA didn't like that Jamaica was getting special treatment from Great Britain in regards to importing bananas. Great Britain decided, Jamaica, since you were a colony of ours, we're going to try to right some of the wrongs of the past. And so we're going to give your bananas special treatment. The USA didn't like this. So they took that to the World Trade Organization and won. That special treatment Jamaica got was now removed, and the banana industry in Jamaica severely suffered. Thousands of people lost their jobs. But it wasn't fair in regards to that most favored nation policy. So in the last several years, one of the things we're seeing is kind of that pendulum swinging from that multilateral action going back towards unilateral action. Some of you may have been aware of things like the trade war going on between the United States and China, the United States and Canada, the United States and the European Union. There's been a push towards that unilateral action and somewhat trade protectionism again. And one of the places where this is really affecting the World Trade Organization is with what's called their appellate body. So back in the end of November in 2019, Donald Trump essentially rendered the appellate body of the WTO useless. Now, the appellate body, it has 7 judges. At least 3 are needed to hear an appeal, and their main ability is to resolve trade disputes between countries. This is pretty much the World Trade Organization's most important function, resolving trade disputes. Well, with some of the judges retiring, there's only 1 judge right now. And again, you need 3 to hear an appeal. And the United States has blocked any new judge from being approved. So what this means is the WTO cannot essentially resolve any trade disputes. So the United States has essentially rendered them useless for the time being. Part of this is because the United States doesn't like some of the stuff that the WTO has deemed illegal. One of the things the United States likes to do is they like to put duties or taxes on countries who they accuse of flooding the U.S. market with cheap goods, which harms U.S. manufacturers. WTO has said this is illegal. So what we're seeing is the pendulum swing back towards sort of a protectionist way of thinking. Now, most information regarding the trade wars that have been going on have been that there's been a reduction in economic activity. So there hasn't really been any benefit to people. However, these things are happening. So that's the WTO.